Our next speaker is Daniel DeBaum. He is the owner of Defender Shield, and I asked him to come speak because we are being bombarded by EMFs and our phones and our iPads and computers and everything else. And he has basically done so much research into this and how to protect ourselves and how we can minimize that toxicity that most of us are aware of, but you can't see it. So it doesn't, you can see the effects of it, but you can't actually see it like some of the other things that we are bombarded by. Daniel's worked for 30 years in engineering in the telecommunications industry, so he's been on that side of things, and through that came through and has sort of created this amazing platform. I'm really excited about the app that he's going to show us because I think it's scary, but I'm hoping that by the end of this we have the answer of how we can keep our homes safe. So thank you, Daniel, for coming.
You're actually looking at what's around you today in real time. You can't smell it. You can't see it. You can't hear it. You can't taste it. But over 20% of us are impacted by it every day. Depending on the symptoms, it could be 40%. So there's no question that our environment is actually changing. These are toxins in our environment, just like any other toxin. Toxins like volatile organic compounds that are chemicals in the air, the toxins we ingest. This is another toxin to the cell. So is it a problem in our lifestyle, impacting our bodies? The answer is yes. A few years ago, my son and I wrote a book about our environment. It was out of frustration to some extent because what we found was the research side of the industry knew a lot about the impacts of these emissions. Somehow or other, the general public wasn't getting that information. So we wrote a book which basically gives you some building blocks about the subject in ways we can all understand it. And if I have any objective today is to share those basic building blocks, so you can make your own choices in the lifestyle you have. In late 70s, I was in Bell Labs. I was using a huge screen, tiny little window, with an acoustical coupling that used to connect to a mainframe 100 feet away from me. What was interesting about that mainframe is it emitted a whole bunch of stuff back then. Today, I have it in my cell phone. The power that I had in that computer years ago is now literally in my hand. The difference is it's touching my body every day. There's a lot of technologies that are around us. We're going to continue using them, but there are also risks associated with those uses. You can see me on the left-hand side at what do you call it? Yes, thank you. And only 38% of us at 2011 had cell phones that were using it regularly. Today, in 2018, 95% of us have it. And so it's coupled along with tablets, PCs, everything around us is now becoming wireless, and it's very, very close to our bodies. Is that a problem? There's two forms of electromagnetic radiation in our environment. There's the stuff that's low. In fact, it's 300 gigahertz or below, hertz or below. And then there's the radio frequency stuff that's around us, and you can see the imaging. Let me put that a little bit in context, though. When you have The really low stuff, that is 60 cycles typically coming out of those products. Then if you go up the spectrum a little bit, it goes into the RF microwave space. And then it goes a little bit higher into the visible light space. And then, of course, it goes to the other end where they have the gamma rays and the X-rays. The X-rays, gamma rays, they're known as ionized radiation. And the lowest stuff is non-ionized radiation. And we'll get a little bit into that, so you'll have a better understanding why I'm breaking that down. One point about the RF, radio frequency stuff, is that most cell phones, our Wi-Fi, are around the 2.4 to 5 gigahertz space. A microwave oven is 2.3 gigahertz. The only difference is the power levels. They are thermal emitting transmissions that heat your cells up when you use your cell phone. It's virtually the same signal. So when you're wondering why your head is hurting and you're wondering why it's heating up, it's because the federal government allows it to heat up by 2 degrees. It's thermally emitting. What happens when it emits, when you feel that emission, it actually is heating up the water between the cells, oscillates the cells, and the cells heat up, and voila, you have cooked meat when it's in a microwave or a cooked ear, depending on what you're cooking. Emissions are omnidirectional. When you talk about a Wi-Fi, that's a commercial Wi-Fi, it's filling the room and then leaving out the room. So it's in all directions. So every time you have your Wi-Fi on, that's what it's doing in the room. It's literally going around, and it's going everywhere around your house. If you have a transmitting cell phone that's also being used, that's also doing the same thing. So one of the things you're happening in your own environments even is that you have all of these transmitters transmitting, and it's changing the ambient environment in your house. So where it used to be really, really non-existent because 20 years ago it didn't exist, to today it's now permeating your room. So as a result of that, there's more and more challenges to the human body as those exposures continue to impact. Now, I mentioned ionized radiation versus non-ionized radiation. This is sort of important, not so much of a technical side, but it really explains what's going on. When you were shot by aliens using gamma rays, what were the gamma rays actually doing? They were taking and literally changing the structure of your atom. If you notice, there's something in the center, which is a nucleus, and on the outside it's an electron. The electrons get hit so hard from the power levels of that signal that it knocks it out of orbit and it charges it. That's why it's called ionized. That's why when you go to the dentist and they throw this heavy thing on top of you and they'd run away and you'd hear this bzzz, and then you came back in, they'd look around to make sure it's okay to move in the room. It's because they were worried about having their electron knocked out of orbit. It's literally true. That's what happens. So when you have that problem, you actually have that exposure, you know there's going to be damaged cells, mutated cells. It will kill you ultimately if you have too much of it. Non-ionizing cells also impacts your cells. So modern thinking today, from the science point of view, is we actually now better understand what's actually going on the non-ionized, the RF stuff that's around us. And I often point out that I don't like the term oxidative stress, which is on the left-hand side. But what's happening is when you smell a chemical, a multiple organic compound, chemicals in the air, it's literally stressing your cells. And that's what is known as an oxidative stress. When you're under oxidative stress, with no oxidative stress, the proteins are passing back and forth between the atoms or the cells. And when it's under oxidative stress, with the EMF, you'll notice that they're not passing proteins now. So it's literally affecting how the proteins communicate in adjacent cells. And so a lot of people sort of don't feel right when they get to these exposures. That's literally why. It's because they're under oxidative stress. The other part that's sort of pretty important to note is that at night, when you're trying to sleep and you have your iPad, iPhone next to your bed and you can't sleep, melatonin's being screwed up. This body system's actually being screwed up just from the radiation, and you can't sleep. So a lot of people will say, hey, I can't sleep at night. There are over 4,000 functions that the body does that's interfered with electromagnetic radiation. So fast forward, don't have any of this stuff in your bedroom because you'll have a problem sleeping. But also note that it's not just oxidative stress you're worried about. It's how your body functions. In the neurological sense, when you talk about balance, when you talk about having headaches, all of those are impacted from these EMF exposures. And at night, if you're in your bed, it's 8 hours. So that's a constant load to the cells for 8 hours. So you got to be careful of that. The bottom, I don't want to talk about too much, but what we now know is the mechanical breakdown of the cell. We actually know that when you have an oxidative stress like that, the membrane actually weakens, and as a result of that weakening, calcium penetrates and basically breaks down the cell and has mutation and DNA damage. So if you have a situation in which if you had a situation in which your daughter at 12 years old put a cell phone in her pocket, there's a potential to damage the egg within the womb, and 20 years later have children, and there could be subtending generations having DNA damaged cells. So it potentially can get pretty serious if you're not sort of managing the environment you're living in. This is a little bit of a description of why now, more so than ever before. When cell phones first came out, they were using an analog signal. In other words, it was a constant load. So we never really experienced too much problems with the body because the cells themselves weren't breaking down. I can take a 10,000-pound elephant and I can put it on a piece of concrete and the concrete won't break. But if I lift that elephant up and I drop the elephant down and lift it up and down, the concrete will break. And that's what I'm depicting here. Between 2 to 4G, there was only one dropping up and down, which was now damaging the cell. And when we go to 5G, there's actually multiple jackhammers in this depiction that actually hitting the cell, making it more and more dangerous to the cell as we progress with generational technologies. For those who don't know, 2 to 4G is the second to fourth generation of cell phone transmission used to transmit back and forth with your cell phone. 5G is the new stuff that's just going to be coming out. And there's projections by many of us in this research space talking about it as being even more dangerous than 2 to 4G. And here it is. That's an actual penetration of an adult male on the left-hand side and with a child all the way through their head. The standard that the FCC has defined as our protection allows, as I mentioned before, 1.6 watts per kilogram to be generated by your cell phone, and that cell phone generation is allowed to heat up the area of your body by 2 degrees. As I said, it's a microwave signal. And so That was developed 30 some odd years ago. It was based on a 6-foot male that occasionally used cell phones. That's what it was based on. Now, 30 years ago, I had a cell phone, and none of my friends had it. So when I wanted to use my cell phone, it would be very, very short periods of time. So the average use at that time was very, very, very low. Fast forward to today, you have children using it, and they're constantly using it. It's going through their head, heating their head up, and we haven't spoke about the biological impact. And it's actually turning out to be far more dangerous than the thermal impact. So that's why we worry about the standards that were developed 30 years ago were built for 6-foot males, and the use of cell phones that has nothing to do with what it is today. And it's not occasional use today is hours at a time, not minutes at a time. So basically the standards we have don't really protect us. In fact, here's another set of images about what happens with children. It literally heats up their head all the way through their body. And honestly, we don't know what the impact's going to be long term. What we know is that a 40-year-old man that's been using a cell phone may have changes to his biological makeup, and it could impact him 10 to 20 years. But when you have a child 6 years old using it and having 90, 30, 80, whatever number of years he'll live, we really don't know the impact of that kind of exposure to a child's brain. Why a child? A male has a fairly thick skull. I have a thicker skull. But a child has a very thin skull. If you look at the composition of the cells within the skull, they're much more fragile. They're really, really growing fast. There's a lot more water content in the brain. As a result of that, it's far more susceptible. Actually, it's 3 to 4 times more susceptible than a male. By the way, a female, it goes halfway through. So she's not, the physical size of a person does impact the penetration into the brain. Let me go to the next one. Yeah, this is close to you. Berkeley went and had required that they wanted to make sure that there was a stamp on cell phone use that was like the ones we use for cigarette smoking today. It warns people that it's a problem. So they actually it was proved and reinforced in courts that that these are dangerous, and that you should be aware that there can be an impact in using them. In fact, with cell phones, I don't know if everybody has spent the time reading the literature that comes with cell phones. They say never put it to your head. They say put it at least 5/8 of inches away from your head, or close to 1 inch away from your head. And by the way, that's there for liability purposes. Their own evidence, I believe, suspects that there's anything close to that creates the problem of damage. It's also true, by the way, that Lloyd's of London and other insurers they will not insure you for this. They think it's a liability, the use of cell phones. So that's something no one tells you about, but it is in fact true in the environment we live in. Okay, this is where this is about the science part of it. I had a colleague. He was lecturing to a large audience about electromagnetic radiation. And he started off by saying, all right, already. We know this is a serious problem. We don't have to be told again that we have a problem. And it turns out, I think he's exactly right. It turns out that there's been thousands of studies over the last several years that are collaborative. These are well-structured studies. They are well-executed studies. Their results are peer-reviewed, and there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that there is clear evidence that there's dangers to the body, and at many levels, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the debate is, the ship is almost sailed. The debate is very clear from a scientific perspective. It's just not generally publicly accepted. There are two kinds of things that really substantiate this more than ever before. And that's epidemiology studies that have recently occurred over the last couple of years. The federal government, the federal government, through their National Toxicity Program, spent $25 million. They set up an environment that was very structured. They eliminated the thermal emission potential and only looked at the biological potential. And this was a large population. In other words, it was statistically significant. And they set out to prove that there was no correlation between cancer and cell phones. Much to their chagrin, what they found is there was an increase with the population that were exposed to predominantly two forms of cancer, one to the frontal lobe, glaucoma, and to the heart. So they were surprised they had statistical significance in the populations of cancer versus those who weren't exposed. That was reinforced with the Ramazani research. Actually, that was the largest study that was out in Europe. And they took 14 countries, and they put some of their research experts on this, and they found the same kind of results. In other words, they had collaborative evidence through statistically significant samples that said this is a problem. So I don't think it's much of a debate as it was 5 years ago. There's now significant, when you talk about epidemiology studies have always led science to understand impacts to humans. So this is leading edge and important messaging that we should understand. In fact, the World Health Organization characterizes electromagnetic radiation as a 2B carcinogenic. That's arsenic, if you don't know what that is. What's really interesting to know is that in draft, it was actually known as a carcinogenic. It wasn't a probable carcinogenic. It was a carcinogenic. The only reason they finalized it without it being considered a carcinogenic was because they didn't think they had statistical evidence to substantiate the claim. They were missing the NTP and Ramazani report. They met in 2011. They haven't met since. So what's happening is evidence has accrued now that substantiates the claim, and so all of us are looking at the likelihood of that being considered a cancer-causing agent by the World Health Organization. And so the data that was missing before, now they have. So I really think it's more important to note that there's so much data that's been created in our laboratories and our environments that they're consistent with the observations of cell damage. We know, I'll give you another example. I saw some data about frontal lobe cancer, glaucoma, which is what they picked up. That's where you'd expect to see it. And the report was saying there was no impact to cancer on the brain. So I looked at the study, and what I found was the average increase in cancer hadn't changed. So it was flat, the average. It turns out the glaucoma grew 2% compounded every year for the last 10 years. So it was the way they were interpreting the data and coming up with it's not a problem. Well, it was. In fact, I have another story. Dr. Who is he? Paul, Dr. Paul. He's out actually in right north of here. He was the one who talked about cell breakdown. I really love the guy because he's really shown us the breakdown of what happens to a cell. And I was reading a report that said that Dr. Martin Paul says there's no cancer from exposures. And I looked at it and I said, that can't be true because I know his work. So I went and looked at the study that they were citing to prove that it wasn't a problem. And it had nothing to do with his position on cell growth and damage to the cell from exposures. So you hear still stories from both sides, but it depends on who's looking at the data. But those who sort of understand the space, I don't think that question about what it is and what it's not is still a debate for most of us. The Buyer Initiative, if you really want to look for where you can find information, these guys do really wonderful work. For the last 5-6 years, they've been investigating and categorizing all worldwide research in this space. So if you're looking to see what is the latest by a set of physicians, doctors, researchers, and trying to understand what's being said about what's coming out of the labs, you really want to look at the Buyer Initiative. Dr. Carpenter is one of the leading guys in there. He's been doing this for years and years. Cindy Sage, who's actually in California. Yes?
As opposed to actual doing research, what about statistics of the number of people that are getting these problems in hospitals?
Oh, there's no question about that. There's been little correlation, but certainly sufficient evidence to conclude this. I have a headache when I went to the doctor. The doctor says take an aspirin. What was the headache caused from? My eye hurts when I'm reading my screen, my screen that I'm on my computer. All right, don't read on your computer. The reality of it is, it was the blue light component of the screen itself that was developing the dry eye. And I had a case recently where a lady was taking drops using dark glasses for 20 years because she was on the screen so much. And it turned out she found glasses that were shielding the blue component, the 240 nanometers that was coming out of the spectrum of light. And it's the blue component of the light, which is on the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, as I mentioned before. And where she was taking drops, within 2 hours, using glasses that shielded that, her eyes were wet again. So there's a lot of stuff going out there that is being treated, but the source of it has not been addressed. And that's a really important point. If you are having problems with balance, for example, you'd conclude you're getting older or you got hit in the head. It turns out that the makeup of your brain actually focuses on eye, ear, and balance. So you can have any symptom like that, and the cause of it is the emissions that are coming from your cell phone or the emissions you're coming from your screen that you're looking at every day for hours at a time. So part of the problem is misdiagnosis. And the more you we're working with clinician groups now, and what we're trying to do is help educate what the sources of potential dangers are, and actually how you can fix some of this stuff too. But you're right. It's misdiagnosis. People don't. 80% of all cancers are environmental. Those are the claims that recently came out in the press, 80%. They didn't even say it was electromagnetic radiation. Ironically, it may be the most significant contributor to that, of those cancers. We know, and I'll get into that in a bit, but it can cause a lot of stuff. We know there can be heart problems. We know there can be congestive problems. We know there can be tumors. Exposure to a female, if you're a male, in 3 to 4 hours after having a laptop in your lap, 25% of your sperm is immobile. And of course, as you've heard recently, everyone's sort of talking about how the male sperm count has been dropping over the last 5-10 years. I don't know if it's because you put your cell phone in your pocket and you're exposing that emission. Your cell phone is pinging 190 times to the tower. And so is there a correlation? Some think so. But most don't recognize it yet. If you're a female and you're exposed 3 to 4 hours, extended periods of time, there's clear evidence of 2% will get tumor within the groin area. Of that, a small portion becomes cancerous. So we know that these things cause problems to the body, and we know it stresses the body out. And here's another thing. I talked about the temporary impacts a little bit. Well, we know that you can have a headache. Your eyes can hurt. You can be foggy. And there are studies that clearly link that to cell phone use. But those are temporary, which also linked to electromagnetic radiation through research is that there's more permanent stuff going on as well. So ADHD, Alzheimer's, all of these neurological impairments that are occurring are being exacerbated by these exposures. And so it can get more and more serious beyond temporary, and we need to know that. Hypersensitivity. I get frustrated a little bit about this because we know that over 20% of the population statistically are electric hypersensitive. And I started off by saying it can be 40% depending on what kind of symptom we're talking about. But on the average, it's greater than 20%. Of that, 80% are women. Why women? No one really knows. But we know that almost 20% of women walking around are hypersensitive. And some can be very, very mild. Some can be very, very serious. Mild being I get a little bit of headache to I can't even leave my front door because once I go out there and I'm exposed to this, it really disrupts my functions so much that I can't go out. In fact, Better Call Saul, he used to walk around with the aluminum on his head. Everyone laughed. It was serious. I've actually known people who actually had the condition that bad. They literally couldn't move their house. It turns out with hypersensitivity, it starts off, I feel it a little bit, and as you age, it gets worse and worse and worse. So if you're not managing your environment to some extent, and you're feeling it, you really want to be careful not to let it go too far because it just gets worse. Ali Johansson, he's out of Sweden. He does a lot of work with electrohypersensitivity. In fact, last year he did a research paper that he published. He not only talked about the oxidative stress which occurs to the cell, he talked about the other functions of the body being impacted, like your immune system. It suppressed the immune system. So if you have a suppressed immune system and there are other toxins in your environment, that's a compounded problem that you really want to avoid. But there is now evidence in his study work that talks about the degraded body in response to other problems with the body. You can read. So I talked about all the things that are a problem in this environment, but there are a lot of things we can do that can help us reduce exposures to some extent. Distance. Believe it or not, it's your best friend. If you have a cell phone right next to you, to your head, you're getting 1.6 watts per kilogram right to your head. That's the worst condition you can have. If you take it 1 foot away, just 1 foot, 80% of the danger to the cells are gone. If you are 4 foot away, 98%. So there is a direct correlation to power levels by distance. It's a mathematical equation. And so if you can find a space and you can get some distance from that space, putting your cell phone a little bit farther away from you, it reduces a substantial amount of potential impact to you. If you turn it off, that's even better, right? So distance, though, is your friend. Duration. If I use a cell phone and it's a 1 minute, 2 minutes, I'm never going to die. But if I have it for 5 hours, 6 hours, the probability that I'm going to have a problem is much increased as a result of that level of exposure. So duration of exposure is something you really want to manage. And then, of course, use shielding. There are a lot of ways of shielding the technology. You can have physical barriers. There are some products on the market that talk about changing the signal so it's more balanced. Whatever you look for when you look for that kind of solution, you really want to make sure that there's independent study work that talks about it being what it says it is. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about what else is the really, really important part of this. It's, believe it or not, it's to healthy your body. We know that if your immune system is down, your gut has leaky gut. You're probably more susceptible to the emission, believe it or not, because you can't build the immune system. Your body immune system is out of your gut, as many of you may know. So you want to make sure that the gut itself is as healthy as it can be. You want to make sure that the cells are healthy. And there are supplements in the marketplace that are very targeted towards healthy cells. So you may want to think about how you keep the cell healthy by looking for these kinds of supplements. And third is mineral balance, particularly for women, by the way. Mineral balance is sort of important. If you're toxified with too much copper or you have too much aluminum in your system, or you don't have enough, that changes the conductivity of your interconnections of the cells. So you want to start thinking about making sure that there's a balance in your minerals. And by the way, 50 years ago, we didn't have to worry about it because everyone grew their own stuff right out of the ground had the minerals. But now that's not necessarily true. So we know that it's not just physical protection you're looking for, time, distance, and shielding, but you also want to make sure you're maintaining a healthy body. Okay. And here's another way of looking at it, too. I often use this as an analogy. I call it bees in the room. If I have one bee in the room, it won't kill me. If I have 1,000 bees sting me, I'm going to die. So that correlates to transmitters in the room. When you have a Amazon box or a Apple box, and it's wirelessly connecting to your router, that's every time you have one of those, it's bees in a room. If you have a cell phone on, there are actually 3 bees in a cell phone. It's the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, and the cell tower. All 3 are transmitting. So all of a sudden you have that many more bees in the room. So as a general principle, you really want to try to find ways of finding those sources and eliminating those sources. At night, for example, if you have a router on at night, and particularly if it's close to your sleeping quarters, actually turn it off because it interrupts the melatonin being generated by your body. It literally mucks around with the process of melatonin. And so, I showed you an image of someone not being able to sleep. It was literally because their melatonin has been disrupted. So a very important point is always simply try to remove as many bees in the room as you can. So let's see next. Every time I give a talk, I'm always asked about 5G. That's the next generation stuff. And so I often point out that there are $7 trillion industry annually. So when they establish a position in the marketplace, they got a lot of money to make sure they can send the messages they want to let you hear. And they have their own groups that can literally make sure the messaging is the messaging they want to have. CTIA, for example, is an organization that is their lobbying groups to the FCC and to other branches of the government to establish positions. Interesting story about that. The chairman of the CTIA 20 years ago, when I was in the business, was a fellow by the name of Wheeler. And he represented all the cell phone providers at that time. About 7 years ago, he became the chairman of the FCC. So here's a guy who represented the industry, and then he became the chairman of the FCC, sort of like the fox in the hen house. And so the $17 trillion business had a guy sitting as the chairman, and he was the one who approved 5G. And he said, we don't need to test it. We don't have to look at it. We got to be faster than everybody else in market, and let me go out there and make sure that America's best in this world. Nobody has ever tested 5G. Nobody. So we don't have scientific evidence of what the impact will be. No studies have been conducted. They're starting to be conducted, but none have been conducted that are anywhere near statistically significant. One point I didn't mention, when I was in the labs, I was sort of required to look at the statistics and then come to conclusions on many subjects. I needed to predict the failure rate of technology that was in the marketplace, and I needed to make it 95% confident that I was accurate. So I needed 11,000 units I had to investigate, and after I analyzed them, I could say confidently, 95% confident that my information was correct. What does that mean? The only way I can do the biological impact of a cell phone is by taking 11,000 children, lock them in the room, and take another 11,000 children and lock them in another room and radiate 11,000 and see what happens, see who dies. That's how I could say it's 95% guaranteed that the results are accurate. So the industry has never really had an accurate way to predict because the populations were never large enough. So it's been very controversial, the subject matter, but we're not going to take 11,000 kids and lock them in a room, see who dies. And in the meantime, you got to look at the data and the study work and look at it from an aggregate point of view, a metadata they call it, and look at what everyone else is finding. And if it's structured right, then it's probably as accurate as. Go ahead.
These cell towers, I mean, from my understanding, each one of these towers, each company can put their own 5G.
Yeah.
One tower may have, let's say there was 4 different companies on there. Let's say AT&T or
Right.
whatever. So, I mean, you're literally being French fried as you're walking underneath, or
So let me explain a little bit about what's going on with the cell towers. If I take a standard cell phone today, I can go 5 miles roughly with a signal, and I can connect. The speed of that, the way in which the signal is characterized works for 5 miles. A 5G signal, which is, I didn't explain this, when a hertz, the 60 hertz I was talking about before, that's what the standard electrical current is within this building and within your house. A hertz. That's 1 cycle per second. 1 cycle per second. So you can think of it this way. You have a wave on a shore ocean, and you have a next wave come by. 1 second between peak to peak. 1 second. When I talk about a kilohertz, that's 1,000 hertz per second. When I talk about a megahertz, that's 1,000,000 cycles per second. When I talk about 1 to 2 gigahertz, which is the framework for a cell phone, that's 1 to 2 billion cycles per second. When we talk about 5G, we're talking about up to 300 billion cycles per second. It's so substantially different than what we have today. Many, many orders of magnitude. That creates a problem in transmission. The problem is it doesn't go very far. It doesn't go 5 miles anymore. It can only go 850 feet. So, here's another statistic. Cell towers, if you live within 1,000 feet of a cell tower, you're 3 times more likely to have cancer generated in your life. 3 times. So the power levels of a cell tower, and you're 1,000 foot away, you're pretty much at risk. With a 5G, you can't go more than 850 feet. So, because it can't go through the trees, it can't go through the concrete, it can't go through all the debris that it has to get to make it work. The speeds are so fast, to be able to make that work, they have to be really, really close. So that's where the 850 feet is. Go ahead, please.
There is a physicist that was he's trying to stop this globally. His name is Dr. Barry Trower.
Yes, I know him well.
And Barry Trower said there's been studies done on this. They know what those 5Gs do.
No. I'm going to talk about what Barry does. So for people who don't know, Dr. Barry is a guy who worked for the UK, and he developed weapons for the UK when he was a younger physicist. He created microwave weapons. He knew what 300 gigahertz would do for you. He knew what 30 gigahertz would do to you. That was his job. And, a parallel story. We heard of the Cuba a year or 2 ago, and everyone got sick, and everyone's saying, oh, this is something new. No, it's not. It's been around for 30 years. It's been used in war for 30 years, and it is using frequencies and power levels that they know exactly what will happen. We know if we send 20 gigahertz to you at 1,000 watts, you're going to get leukemia. We know that. Well, they know that. I don't know that. General public doesn't know that.
How about we have solar?
I'm sorry?
We have solar power.
Yes.
And the boxes that are mandatory with that, do you know what their the hertz output is?
Yes. What's being generated out of those cells is a DC signal. DC is not, it doesn't rotate, it's not a cycle. So in that sense, it's okay, because from an electromagnetic point of view, there's no electrical component to it, but there is a magnetic component to it. The cell doesn't know the difference between electrical or magnetic. It sees it as the same for both. So Prower, actually, by the way, talks about there's no difference, in his opinion, and I somewhat agree with him. So you have that DC component, and then there's a converter, which is transformers. And that transformers are used to convert to AC. It's a cycle, 60 cycle. And so there's as much emissions coming out of that, in fact, more so than if it was just a standard AC system. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
I'm not quite clear on this. So you're saying basically these 5G towers really only emit about 850 feet, so they're going to be...
Yeah, they're going to be 850 feet. Every 850 feet you can see a tower, because they can't go any farther. So the density of 5G towers is at least, it's something like 7 or 8 times the density of today. It's unbelievable. You will have it 850 feet. It will not. I'll give you a little story too. I work with a neurologist, and he called me up on a Saturday morning, and he said something's going on. He's a hypersensitive guy, electrohypersensitive, and he called and he said something's really going on, and I don't know what it is. I said, go look at your router. He went to look at the router. It was a 5G router. They were trialing 5G in his area. And he, his head was seriously hurting, and he didn't know why. And I said, turn it off, see what happens. 2 hours later, his headaches went away. So there was a different response for him. Even though he's hypersensitive, it turned out he had a different response to just the transmission to his Wi-Fi. By the way, a little more detail than you may want to know, but the reason Wi-Fi is so really, really important is not for your cell phone. They can eliminate the cable to your house. It's not the cell phone necessarily. The broadband aspects of 5G allows them to eliminate all the wiring. The most costly component of a cable plant is the cable and the ground. And so the real drivers are, I'm going to be able to beat the cable companies at service to your house, and I'll eliminate all the wiring by going to it. So there's a lot of motivation to 5G for them, and I'm struggling with what's the benefit to us, because I like my cable. I get every service I want. The Internet of Things, which is about 5G connecting to everything is really, they're saying, the driver. But in theory, there's no technology that can't be done with current 4G than they're claiming to be 5G. So I'm not sure I understand fully the story, but I do understand the financial side and what the drivers are. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think this is totally to sterilize people because they know that it cooks the girls' ovaries. But the big thing about these 5Gs, they put them in poor neighborhoods first. I have one 8 houses down the street from me, and they put them on the schools first.
Yeah, it's terrible. And you heard me talk about children. It's really, in my opinion, absolutely a very serious problem.
Well, I just quit a job last week at a school because I was standing 200 feet in front of that thing.
Yeah, and I understand.
5Gs on it. I was sick for the 4
Yeah.
days that I worked
Yeah, and it's psychosomatic. It is literally a physical response. Right. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
What does Wi-Fi stand for?
Wide area, why?
Wireless fidelity.
Thank you. Yeah. And they use 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And the standard they use is not the same standard for cell phones. It's more liberal. Go ahead.
I have a cochlear implant, and it's attached to a magnet inside my head,
Yeah.
and that goes to a little thing where there's little diodes at the end that goes to the cochlea.
Right.
Do I need to be concerned about the 3 times more likely cancer?
There's no scientific evidence that says it is or not.
If she has metal in her brain, wouldn't this attack her first?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the antenna part, which is if you would ask me to predict, based on knowledge we have now, I would say there could be a problem. Pacemakers, all these things are going to be impacted because it's different than what we've had in our environment in the past.
If someone has a pacemaker and walks under those, could it just
Yeah.
knock their
Look,
device out of?
our body works with an electrical infrastructure. There's microelectric communications between all our cells. I can take my cell phone, and you can push my arm down, and I'll keep the cell phone away, and you'll have a real problem pushing my arm down, right? If I put my cell phone next to my heart, and I ask you to push my arm down, it'll go right down. It's screwing around with my electrical systems.
I want to let you know you're going to have a few more minutes.
Okay.
I want to finish up.
Okay.
You can continue, but
I always love answering questions more than talking. But blood-brain barrier is a big deal. We know that 1.6 watts per kilogram, which is a cell phone, is a power level that can potentially interrupt. Well, if the blood-brain barrier is down on your head, 0.1 watts can create damage to the cells in your brain, the frontal lobe brain. So we know that when you start going up to the 300 gigahertz, that you have a problem with blood-brain barrier. We know that. Let me get to the 5G part on the bottom. Active denial. It's a little bit of what we were talking about before. 90 gigahertz is known in science to have an impact to the body. That's why 90 gigahertz is used in active denial. If you're a crowd that's out of control, they shoot this thing towards you, what happens? You get really, really hot. Your heart starts pounding really, really fast. Why? It turns out there's a natural resonance of your sweat glands. And we know through science that the sweat gland will act as an antenna, and it will absorb much more rapidly the emissions. Remember, 5G is within the 300 gigahertz range. 90 gigahertz is within the 300. So we know there are really dangerous signals that can really interrupt our bodies, particularly 90 gigahertz. And there was literally no concern for those kinds of resonance within the natural body response. And of course, as we go into the 5G space, we're going to learn more and more. Any other questions?
Trump just raised the radiation levels on the EPA. What are the scientists trying to do to push back on that, or are they?
You know,
He raised it this week, last Friday, at a 5G summit in the White House, and everybody was talking about Kavanaugh.
so they're talking about 6G and beyond. All right? So we talked about gigahertz, billion things per second passing into your body. They're now talking about terahertz and beyond. They're actually getting towards the ionized levels. And so when you go from billions to trillions, no one really knows from any research what the impact will be to the body. But if I were to predict, I would predict it's not so good. You had a question?
Have heard cell phones related or compared to cigarettes and how doctors used to smoke and promote them, and they were in movies and airplanes and everywhere. And so now we have our cell phones everywhere and airplanes
Right.
and schools. So I'm just wondering, what do you see 10 years in the future, 50 years in the future?
I'll tell the story about smoking as quickly as I can. I was smoking at 12 years old. Why? There was nothing in the public domain that said there was a linkage between cancer, smoking, and lung disease. None, right? And so at that time, all the cigarettes industry knew there was a direct correlation. In fact, in the late 70s, I actually recall having the chairman of Philip Morris in front of children doctors, and he was asked, "Is this bad for women to smoke?" And he said, "Absolutely not." And then he thought about it a little bit, and he said, "Wait a minute, though. The baby's going to be smaller. What woman wouldn't want a smaller baby?" That's what he said. So the mentality at that time was that kind of messaging. Would I say there's a parallel between that and EMF? There's absolutely not, in my mind, that's exactly the same correlation. And I'll make it even worse than that. It was Dr. Paul. He's almost becoming radical because we talked about subtending generations. With the impact of the 12-year-old girl before, he thinks it's catastrophic in three generations. He thinks it's crisis at that point. And of course, he's saying it's too late by then because we didn't recognize the problem. Have I run out of time? No?
Yeah, one more question.
One more question. Go ahead.
If you can go to that would be great.
So did I hear you say, and forgive me for being lacking in scientific knowledge, did you say that the signal for cell phones is different than the Wi-Fi signal that, people use with formal books?
Right.
And I'm asking specifically, because I've got a kid who goes to the public school, and all public schools now are
Right.
they're really excited that everything is
Yeah.
kids use wireless.
Yeah, let me talk about it a little bit. Cell phones are roughly around 1 to 2 gigahertz. Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. They're all pretty close. Difference is Wi-Fi has more power levels than a cell phone. Rather than 1.5 watts, it can be up to 6 watts. Why is that a problem? Particularly in schools, it's a problem because, well, let me talk about this space. No, let me talk about your home. In your house, it's probably less than 0.1 watts in your room. If you talk about a school that's using Wi-Fi with their laptops or tablets, it's 0.5 watts. That's 1/3 the strength of a signal. The difference is it's a constant load. It's always on. So remember I talked about duration of time? That's when time starts playing a big role because it's over the 7 hours that is the exposure. And as you may recall, I talked about 1.1 watt being able to do the DNA damage to frontal lobe of the brain.
So, I mean, what, if anything, can be done to protect our kids? If I don't have the ability to keep them home from school.
Yeah, I talked about bees in the room because you really should be diligent about doing that because there's clearly impact. In the classroom, I got a real problem. I've written articles that talk about guns in the room. I literally believe we're using technology that's used, as we talked about before, is part of the arsenal of guns that are used in war. And that's literally, and Bauer, by the way, he makes a lot of noise about that subject, especially in Canada. He talks about the exposures that he developed was around the 2.5 gigahertz space. So there's nothing we can do about it except complain. Go to your, I mean, literally. You know, I'm asked this often. What do you do? And I'll tell you a story. On the cigarettes, what changed the cigarette world? They were losing in court. Literally, that's literally they were forced because they lost in court. And we know that in Europe, for example, there have been several cases now in which they've won in court. They've taken out of the classrooms, they've taken it out of because they lost in court. And I see that starting now. So, and I'm hopeful that begins starting in the U.S.
You know what, parents can go to school board meetings,
Yeah.
they can get other groups of people together, and you should complain about this at your
Yeah.
school board meeting.
And your town council and
And by the way, I don't think it's regulatory that you should go to. It's really at the grassroots level that is the change will be made, in my opinion.
You know what I did? Mr. Quirk, Assemblyman Quirk, co-authored the bill to put those 5G cell towers in with Senator Waso. I passed out 3,000 papers all over the state. I had his phone number on there. I said, call him. And I said, tell him, I don't want it in front of his office and his house first.
Right.
He's now moving to Union City. So Mr. Quirk is the state assembly who wrote that bill, and he also wrote the bill because those cell towers caused those Northtel fires. He wrote a bill that PG&E was not liable for it, and it's put on our PG&E bills. Mr. Quirk should be in jail. And if people don't speak up or try to do something about this, this is why I
Yeah.
go to city councils and all kinds of meetings.
Yeah.
I want to expose them.
How do you spell his name?
Quirk, like Quirky, Q-U-I-R-K.
Yeah, by the way, with 5G,
Assemblyman Quirk, Bill
What-
Quirk.
with 5G, I was the chairman of the Planning and Zoning Board for my town. No cell tower could be built without my approval. He turned me off.
I know, we need to get ready.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you very much, everyone.
And history for the